Hello, welcome everyone. We're so glad to have you with us. My name is Katie Cannon. I'm the Curator of Education at the DAR Museum. The DAR Museum is a decorative arts museum in downtown Washington, D.C. And one of our main exhibits is the period rooms. So that's each room shows a different time period in American history. And one of those rooms we're going to be focusing on today in our topic here is showing the house of a German immigrant family from the 1860s, and they lived in Texas. And so with me today are our guest speakers. We're delighted to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
And so I'd be happy to introduce them. I hope you all will check out too. This is part of our monthly lecture series, and so we have a whole host of these lectures that we also archive on our YouTube channel. Hannah Kellogg developed a love for living history at a young age, perhaps when her grandmother made colonial dresses out of the old living room drapes so they could blend in for a trip to colonial Williamsburg. She received her bachelor's in history from Liberty University and her master's in public history from James Madison University. Her work has included time at George Washington's Mount Vernon and George Branch Historical Park and a museum professional development consultancy. Currently, she is the farm manager at the Sauer-Beckmann Living History Farm, where she cooks on a wood-burning stove and milks a cow. And then our other speaker is Terri Wilson, who graduated with an elementary bilingual education degree from Texas A&M Corpus Christi. She has taught various grades all over the state of Texas, including the 4th, 1st, and kindergarten. She first learned of living history while an educator in 2011. In 2015, Terri was a seasonal interpreter at the Sauer-Beckmann Living History Farm and enjoyed it so much she later joined the staff full-time. She is passionate about Texas history and genealogy. As the domestic skills interpreter at the Sauer-Beckmann, she can often be found tweaking the 1910 Singer sewing machine and ensuring the flower beds would make German farm wives proud. So welcome, Hannah and Terri.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, as you saw a little bit from that brief overview, Terri and I have both lived in many different places and traveled a fair bit. So talking about immigrant experiences is something that we can sympathize and empathize a little bit with, just in the fact of being a new person, that new person in school or the new person in town. You had an experience where you grew up close to the border with Mexico, and then you moved to East Texas, which you would think moving from Texas to Texas, if you don't know about the size of Texas, is not a big deal, but there's a bit of culture shock.
Big time.
Yeah.
Very different. As a teenager, that was not fun.
A little bit of mispronunciation because nobody in East Texas knew how to pronounce anything close to Mexico.
No, they did not know. And I was a fish out of water in my own state.
Yep. So with that experience, we feel very strongly about how it was for the Germans when they came to Texas. Going, we're in a new place. Nobody speaks the same language we do, has the same culture. So what do we do with that? How do we adapt? And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're just going to share our PowerPoint with you right now. And we will get started on talking about German immigrant experiences during the Civil War. All right, hopefully y'all can all see that. So we're also going to focus in on 2 different families. You've got there at the DAR Museum, the picture on the left. So if you go visit the DAR Museum, this is what you're going to see, the bedroom from the Mavis family. We understand it's pronounced Mavis. It's M-E-W-E-S. And our apologies at the very beginning for any mispronunciation of German names. We're not the best at pronouncing them. So we speak Texas German here, which is a very southern version of pronouncing these names. We understand it was pronounced Mavis. So on the left there is the DAR period room, the Mavis family's bedroom from 1860. The picture on the right is from here at the farm. We work at the Sauer-Beckmann Living History Farm, and that is the kitchen from the Sauer family. And that's the 2 families that we're going to be contrasting today. And just a quick overview of where we work, because that plays into why we're here today. The Sauer-Beckmann Living History Farm is part of Texas Parks and Wildlife. So we're officially part of the state park system. We're officially part of Lyndon B. Johnson State Park, and a lot of folks might wonder why there's a German farm at a state park named after a president who was not German. This is a fair question. LBJ was born in Stonewall, Texas, which was a predominantly German community. And when he was setting aside his land to the national park, across the river from us is LBJ National Park, he wanted to preserve the heritage of his hometown. And that is why he's wanted this farm preserved to kind of showcase what his neighbors were living like. And his neighbors were predominantly German. So here at the farm, we go through each day as if it were 1918. World War I is the time period. So we are also planting cotton, milking the cow, taking care of the garden, cooking, cleaning, trying to keep alive those skills and traditions. We also do a big butchering program. So if you come visit, that is what you will see us doing. So today is a bit of a treat for Terri and I to be inside in air conditioning.
It's nice.
It does not normally happen. Normally we're outside sweating, but we let the other coworkers have that today. So that's a brief overview about us at LBJ. So now let's dig into talking about Texas history. Now, many of you have probably heard the phrase, everything's bigger in Texas. So let's start briefly with a comment on the size of Texas. From north to south, Texas is about 800 miles, and it's not much shorter from east to west. So when we talk about immigration or historical events in Texas, look at these maps to try and compare, okay, look at the sizes that we're talking about. Think about the diversity in culture and opinions in these areas, and that might give a bit of perspective on how many differences in culture, beliefs, daily life, everything can be in one state. We also want to talk a little bit about the role that immigration played in Texas history and Texas history as a whole. We are assuming that not all of you had Texas history in 4th grade. So with that, please bear with us as we try and set the stage for everybody else. Of course, when you think of Texas, you think of possibly what might come to mind: cowboys, Indians, salsa, chips, Tex-Mex food, chicken fried steak, longhorns, maybe recently some hurricanes and some bad weather. But just like any state, there's a lot more to it than just what makes a tourist brochure. So a lot of folks don't realize that Texas was a major port for immigration, particularly the town of Galveston. So if y'all aren't familiar with Texas geography, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but down here along the coast is the port of Galveston, close, not too far from Houston. Galveston was kind of like our Ellis Island. You might be familiar with Ellis Island and its role in immigration in the Northeast on the East Coast, Angel Island on the West Coast. Well, Galveston was that for the South and even up through the Midwest. Between 1845 and 1924, over 150,000 immigrants from Mexico, Central South America, Europe, Asia, Africa entered Texas and the American Midwest through Galveston. Germans were some of the first to arrive. Then came French, Swedish, Italian, Irish, Polish, Czech, Swiss. There were even Jewish societies in New York City that would encourage Jews fleeing oppression in Eastern Europe to go to Texas. In Texas, someone fleeing oppression could get their own town, and if they went to New York, they might end up in a tenement. In the 20th century, Chinese and Japanese began immigrating to Texas. With its proximity to Mexico, Texas has always been a steady stream of immigrants from Mexico and further south. And of course, in the 19th century, many African Americans are brought to Texas, many against their will, and then later, after emancipation, move for economic opportunity as well. When you drive through Texas today, you can tell from the names of towns and street signs and cuisine what cultures first settled here. So when we discuss the Germans, keep in mind, they're just one of many people groups that make up Texas. And of course, before we even talk about them, we should talk about the people that were here first, because they also affect the culture and makeup of Texas. Here's your fast track through Texas history. Before any Europeans arrived, this area was home to many First Peoples, dating back about 14,000 years. Again, large area, so a lot of diversity in the kinds of Native Americans that lived here. Along the coast, you have semi-nomadic tribes like the Karankawa. They move close to the coast or further away from the coast, depending on the hurricane season. In East Texas, you have much more settled farming tribes like the Caddo Indians. They're more farmers and traders than the ones that might make Hollywood fame that you maybe have seen on TV or on old shows are the Comanche and the Apache towards the west, and they're much more nomadic, traveling across the plains. The first Europeans who arrive in Texas are the Spanish. They stepped foot in Texas in 1528. They don't establish their first mission until 1681, but even then, their focus is really further south, so they don't really begin colonizing Texas in earnest until 1716. Texas, just like all the other American colonies, is caught up in the back and forth of European power struggles. Eventually, Mexico, which included Texas, revolted from Spain and achieved independence in 1821. As a young nation, Mexico continues the immigration program that had begun under Spain. By 1824, about 300 families from the United States had traded their American citizenship for Mexican citizenship and moved to Texas. They come to establish farms and towns, making the land civilized in Anglo and Mexican eyes. Mexico hoped these new outposts would boost their economy and secure their northern border. Unfortunately, conflicts arose as many Anglo settlers promoted economic ties with New Orleans and the United States instead of Mexico City. Though Mexico eventually made special provision for these immigrants to bring slaves, there was conflicts because as a whole, Mexico prohibited slavery. And many of the settlers from the United States said they could not survive without their slaves. And what we have right here on the screen is part of the land grant from Stephen F. Austin when he works on bringing out settlers to Texas. So that's one of the, I believe it's for White is one of the contracts that they had to sign. So after several years of political instability in Mexico, Antonio López de Santa Anna becomes president and revokes the Constitution of 1824. Revolts break out in many Mexican colonies, not just in Texas, because many people, especially on the outskirts, did not like the idea that the federal government was being replaced by an authoritarian one. In Texas, many protested the change and demanded a return to the Constitution of 1824 that guaranteed more rights for those at the edges of the Mexican Empire. When Santa Anna responds with a strong military response to clamp down on the rebellion, the Texans fight back, and after much debate, eventually declare independence on March 2nd, 1836. After a series of defeats, including the famous Battle of the Alamo, Texas wins its independence at the Battle of San Jacinto, April 21st of 1836. The independent state of Texas really wants to join the United States. Most of the folks that fought, not all, but many of the ones who fought were from the United States originally, but the United States turned them down. The United States did not want to annex the state of Texas because they feared that a border with Mexico would cause political tension, which it still does. They also worried that adding such a large slave state would swing the balance in the Senate towards slavery. They also thought Texas might one day be divided into smaller states, which would definitely swing the balance towards slavery. But after several years, the United States government begins to worry that the British Empire was taking a great interest in Texas. Texas at that point was already starting to produce cotton, which did a great job fueling the mills of England. Primarily to stop any possibility of British influence on its western border, the United States annexes Texas, and Texas becomes the 28th state on December 29, 1845. It's during these exciting times in Texas history, as it transitions from Mexican colony to independent nation to part of the United States, that German immigration enters the story. Germans had been present from the very beginning. Some of the first 300 colonists that came from the United States were of German origin, and there were a few that even fought in the Texas Revolution. But it was a publication of several books in the early 1830s that really put Texas on the map. Now, these books told of thousands of acres free for the taking, a mild climate just like Sicily that made it possible for farming to happen year-round. You could also create a lot of raw goods that would be sent back to Germany and boost the fatherland's economy. At first, Germans came in small amounts as individual farmers and merchants set out across the ocean to look for new opportunities. Those that came often wrote back letters that were published in local newspapers praising low taxes and the chance to acquire thousands of acres of land. But we know that with any story of immigration, it isn't just the hope of a brighter future that causes families to uproot and sail across to the New World. There are many reasons to leave Germany as well. In Germany, economics, politics, and religion all play a part in promoting immigration. For those fortunate enough to own land, the land passes to the eldest son, leaving later sons with no property. As families continue to grow and expand, land becomes more scarce and overpopulation is a concern for many of the rulers. The potato blight in the late 1840s, we mostly know about the potato famine because of Irish history, but it also destroys crops in Germany and in much of northwestern Europe. Industrialization has taken a toll. Factories are undermining home industry, and guilds and small family businesses are becoming irrelevant because it can be made cheaper in a factory. Economic depressions fuel political instability. Also, France deposes its king in 1848. That revolution has ripple effects in the neighboring German states. Of course, keep in mind, Germany is not a nation at this point. So here's a map showing all the different kingdoms that are making up the German Confederation at this point. There's about 23 states. A nationalist movement kind of sweeps the area, and folks are fighting, some folks are uprising for a united Germany. Then the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx comes out about this time, encourages Germans to revolt against the whole capitalist system. So for intellectuals looking for a place to bring about a political utopia, the wide open spaces in Texas look promising. For those tired of the fighting going on in Europe, maybe some of those folks are on the opposite side of whichever ruling nobility, their belief, their religious system. So if you're on the opposite side of that, you might want a little bit more freedom. But it wasn't just farmers, merchants, and political revolutionaries that think going to Texas is a good idea. In 1842, German noblemen from about 10 different kingdoms and duchies founded the Association for the Protection of German Immigrants to Texas. This association, often known as the Adelsverein, was created to alleviate overpopulation and create a new market for German goods. They secured from the government of Texas the promise of 2 million acres for German settlement. Texas wanted more non-Spanish speaking white settlers to cultivate their land and secure their borders. But they also wanted to keep the best land for themselves. So the land grant set aside for the German settlement was actually very poor quality for farming and on the Texas frontier, which puts the new settlers in competition with Native Americans for resources. Despite their poor planning and rather naively optimistic dreams, the Adelsverein shipped some 10,000 German immigrants to Texas in just 2 years between 1844 and 1846. So here's a contract that was signed actually in Germany with the agent of the Adelsverein to bring over a German family. For someone to travel with the Adelsverein, they had to be of good reputation, and they had to put up a good sum of money for the trip. These were not the poorest of the poor, but rather farmers, merchants, intellectuals with enough resources to pay their way to a new land. Despite the Adelsverein going bankrupt and being unable to fulfill many of the promises they made, the German immigrants pushed through these obstacles, and they settled across Texas. As they established towns, many write back and encourage their family members to come. That creates chain immigration. That continues for the rest of the century. By 1850, Germans constitute more than 5% of the Texas population. By 1860, before the start of the Civil War, Germans in Texas numbered at least 30,000. Many people think this is an undercount, but at least they've got 30,000 on the rolls. The numbers continue to grow through the rest of the 19th century. And German immigration has left a huge mark on Texas. So Terri and I work at a farm that depicts a German farm during World War I. We mentioned how Terri is in charge of the flower beds. Well, recently she was researching old seed catalogs to see what kind of flowers and plants would have been appropriate for our World War I era farm. So we came across a number of seed catalogs from San Antonio. This particular seed company was started by a German immigrant that came in the early 1800s. And we noticed, look at the languages that everything's printed in, at least the titles. Yeah, the main heading's in English, but all of the new categories of veggies have it in Spanish and German, because those are the 3 languages that made up San Antonio. And this is through the early 20th century. And the language stayed on longer in the small towns. We are near the town of Fredericksburg, Texas, which if you're in this area, is pretty famous for, well, there's a lot of wineries and breweries and distilleries, a lot of alcohol, but it's also a good vacation destination for the rest of Texas. And if you had come visited Fredericksburg in the 1980s, not that long ago, if you went to a department store or went and saw who was having coffee at 8 a.m. at the local watering hole, you would have heard German spoken. The language lingers on almost up until the turn of the century, until 2000. So now that you've got a big picture of where Germans fit into Texas history, let's focus in on their attitudes and actions during the war. We'll say this a couple of times, but it's something we always try and do. Try and put yourself in their shoes. You just moved to a strange new world. You're learning new languages, not just English, but also Spanish. If you're on the frontier, you might be interacting with the local Native American tribes. You need to communicate with them too. In some cases, you might be fighting with them. You're learning new farming techniques, new foods, new crops. The climate is so different from what you're used to. You have blistering hot summers, but you also have mild winters, so you can farm year-round. But it's not just climate and culture that you're adapting to. Texas is in turmoil. The Mexican-American War starts in 1846, and many of the Germans brought over by the Adelsverein find that their promised wagons and transportation from the coast have been commandeered for the war effort. No sooner does Texas gain a firm boundary on the Rio Grande when the war ends in 1848, than everyone's attention turns to the question of slavery. Disputes over what land belonged to Texas and what newly acquired territory could be used to expand slavery is one of the reasons we have the Compromise of 1850. Now, fights over slavery's expansion happens all across the United States frontier. 4 years later, bitter fighting breaks out in Kansas as slaveholders and abolitionists fight to sway the territory to their ideology. For the newly arrived German immigrants who came looking for peace and opportunity and instead arrived in the state fighting border disputes and arguments about slavery, it's not really what they were hoping for. The first official statement on the German immigrant view on slavery comes out of a Sangerfest, or a singing festival, in San Antonio in 1854. The Germans had added on a political gathering to the festivities and assured locals that they needed their own organization just because of the language barrier. They weren't up to any nefarious purposes as foreigners in Texas. They just wanted to be able to communicate with their fellow German speakers. A lot of different resolutions about public education and things come out of that. But one of their resolutions from that gathering in 1854 is the most controversial one that stated, slavery is an evil, the abolition of which is a requirement of democratic principles. They felt strongly about this and published the resolution in both English and German. The pushback was swift. Not only did Texans denounce these foreigners, but so did fellow German immigrants. Many Germans published rebuttals across Texas, arguing that this organization did not speak for all Germans, and their neighbors should take no notice of these few radicals. It was clear from the beginning that German immigrants, just like the rest of the United States, were divided on the subject. So take a moment. What would you do if you were a newcomer to a country that was fracturing over multiple political conflicts? Would you try to just stay out of it and see what happened? Things didn't end well for those who tried that strategy. What would influence you to take a certain side? Your job, your religion, family, neighbors, the newspapers you read and the folks you spoke to? Just like we do today, the Germans found themselves in the middle of a national fight and quickly had to figure out where they stood. Our background, our upbringing, the ways we view the world, they all play a large role in how we make decisions. The Germans were no different. For some, slavery was just a different version of the serfdom they knew back home. In 1843, Joseph Count of Busswaldeck, an aide-de-camp to the Duke of Nassau, came to Texas as one of the founding members of the Adelsverein. He promptly purchases slaves on his way to Texas and founds the Nassau plantation. As a nobleman, having slaves work the land was not so different from overseeing serfs. For those from higher class backgrounds, the racial hierarchy was not a far stretch from the strict social hierarchy that they had come from. In contrast, for intellectuals and poor farmers who came seeking a life free from such oppression, replicating serfdom was the last thing they wanted to do, which made slavery an evil in their eyes. But perhaps there were some who always wanted to have a higher class. In that case, slavery could be a means to achieving riches they could only dream of in Germany. Perhaps the biggest impact on Germans and the question of slavery was location. And in this case, a little bit of geography here, mixing with our history, because it all plays a part. The geographical map of Texas probably does the best job explaining why slavery was embraced in some areas and not in others. So looking at this map, you can see eastern Texas borders slave strongholds like Louisiana, with New Orleans as a major port to purchase slaves. Those that settled from the deep south were entrenched in a culture that depended on a slavery economy. The amount of rainfall means rich soil and the opportunity to cultivate hundreds of acres of cotton or other cash crops. For those without quite so much rain, but still good soil, those Texans had large ranches that used slaves as cowboys. For Germans who settled in these areas, investing in slaves was just a part of adapting to local culture. If the Germans wanted to succeed, they felt they had to invest the way the locals did. For those in the western part of the states, the lack of rain meant large plantations were not profitable. Small farms or ranches were your only option. So investing in lots of manpower was not the best way to make money. The lack of rain meant the need to irrigate and keep your farm small. The frontier also meant you were further from slave markets, and there was a place your slaves could escape to. Frontier towns could be isolated, so there were often towns settled entirely by immigrants. For the Germans in the Texas Hill Country, they made up the majority in almost 10 counties, so they did not feel the same pressure to assimilate that other Germans did. I don't know if you can see my cursor at all, but when we talk about the Hill Country, we are talking about central Texas. You'll notice it's kind of the dividing line between the green on the west and the much further brown, the green on the east and the much further brown on the west. So this area is like the Edwards Plateau, where it kind of rises up. So the Hill Country is pretty much smack dab in the middle of Texas, and that is where a lot of Germans settled. So just so you know, when we're referencing the Hill Country, we are referencing the very central part of Texas, where there are actually hills, which is unusual for all parts of Texas. It's right there in the middle. So those Germans, like we said, made up the majority in about 10 counties. So they were free to do more what they wanted without having to rely on local approval. Also, those on the frontier rely heavily on federal troops for protection from Indian raids. And it's a huge boost to the local economy to have a fort nearby. So if you live on a frontier town, you feel closely connected to the United States military, and you value the daily federal presence. For those deeper in the east or in the south, the federal government has very little impact on your life. So there was your quick race through Texas history and geography, and a little bit about why the Germans came and where they settled and how the local area impacted them. So with all of that in mind, let's now dig into the two families that we're going to be talking about today. And Terri has done a lot of research on these two families.
This has been fun genealogy research with names and the way people wrote, but we'll start in 1846. Friedrich Sauer is 7 years old when he comes to Texas from Germany with his father, his sister, and his brother. They are following his sister's husband, Peter Kuhlmann, who arrived in Texas a few months before them, December 1845. In 1854, Mr. Mavis comes to Texas as an adult. He's 33 years old. He has his wife and one of his young daughters. Later, he has more. His family history says that they came with the Prowse family and that the Mrs. Prowse is related to Mrs. Mavis. And so they come with them into Texas. The Sauers headed for the Hill Country, which was very rural, and it's becoming an established German community. Now, the Mavis family went into LaGrange, Texas in Fayette County. It was an Anglo community that did have a German contingent, which the family history says was good since they didn't speak English yet. As for trade, Friedrich Sauer is listed as a wagoner in the 1860 census. He's in Grape Creek territory, or part of Gillespie County. He lived his whole life in Gillespie County. And eventually, after the war, he becomes a cotton farmer. Mr. Mavis, according to his family history, he had started as a baker in LaGrange in Fayette County, and that bakery, along with much of that street, burned down. The neighbors had taken up money and offered them the charity money, and he refused it, saying he was young and he could, work and he's strong, and give it to somebody who doesn't need it. Eventually, he moves to Eagle Lake in Colorado County and opens the first home hotel there. He is still paying county taxes on it in 1860. He sells that also in 1860 and opens the first home hotel in Alleyton, Texas, also in Colorado County. It was important during the Civil War because it was the last part of the railroad system in that area. So later on, they use it to get cotton from southern states to try to wagon it to Mexico to sell it. So he saw, I guess, the railroad as possibly a potential boon to his home hotel. We are unable to locate the 1860 slave schedule for either Colorado County or Fayette County. But according to the Colorado County tax rolls, Mr. Mavis owned 2 slaves for 1864 and 65, they were still itemizing those 2 years what you were paying taxes on. For some reason, possibly because of the war, both in Gillespie County and in Colorado County in 1863, they didn't itemize. They squished everybody into, like, usually they would take the whole page for one person to write out, you know, did you own a wagon? Did you own cattle? Well, in 1863, they squished it, just put your name and how much your total property value was. So I suspect in 1863, he may have owned some enslaved persons that he paid taxes on, because in 1862, he was not paying taxes on enslaved peoples, and his total value of property was $740. In 1863, he pays $2,200. We don't know what for. And in 1864, paying taxes on 2 enslaved persons, it's $2,200 as it is in 1865. So I'm assuming that he already purchased slaves at that point. He was not owning property other than a lot of land in a city at that time. Mr. Sauers is a young single man up until 1865 when he marries. And at 1865, he's paying tax on acreage. So he is interested in becoming a farmer. To our knowledge, other than being a wagoneer, he was not a merchant that owned a store or anything like that. Mr. Mavis is married. He has more children as he's here in Texas. And he's listed as a merchant in the 1860 census. The family tells us he owned a home hotel at that point, but we only have him in the 1860 census. He comes here in 1854, passes away in 1867. So county tax rolls are what we're using for other documentation on him. He owned town lots in LaGrange, Eagle Lake, and Alleyton, but I've never found that he paid taxes on actual acreage. So we do not believe he was ever a farmer. He's just a businessman. A side note to that for me is Mr. Prouse, the family that he came with that's related to his wife, never paid taxes on an enslaved person. So he chose not to own slaves. So that's just a little bit of a family comparison and trade comparison on our 2 families. Back to Hannah.
So we've got 2 very different men here. One is a farmer, comes much younger, settles in primarily German community. One comes older, more established. He's an entrepreneur. He's a businessman. So by looking at these 2, we can get kind of just a little snapshot of random people that happen to arrive in Texas at this time and how they experienced the war. Now, the biggest thing that probably had an impact on them and their choices were the communities that they lived in. So here we're going to compare Gillespie County, where the Sauers lived, and Colorado County, where the Mavis family lived. Well, the Texas Hill Country, which is in central Texas, and you can see right there, smack dab in the middle, that rectangular shaped county that's shaded in, that is Gillespie County. And that's the county that we're in right now. In 1860, Gillespie County only has 33 enslaved people. That same year, citizens of Gillespie County reject secession by a vote of 400 to 17. While some expressed strong anti-slavery sentiment, others worried about how vulnerable their homes would be if the federal troops left. Many of the Germans were immigrants who had just recently sworn an oath of loyalty to the United States. They'd come during a time when nationalist sentiment was sweeping the German states, and the idea of a strong central government was appealing. Many had known infighting and division back in Europe and did not want to see that again. In contrast, the Germans in Colorado County might have also desired a national government and a peaceful life, but they were not in a predominantly German area. This economy was drastically different. Gillespie County relies on small farms and ranches. Colorado County is dependent on cotton with large sheep and cattle ranches. In 1860, 306 slaveholders owned more than 3,500 African Americans. Just a few years earlier, almost 400 slaves actually tried to escape south to Mexico. It's one of the few attempted slave insurrections in Texas. Before they could realize their plans, they're found out, and several are executed and many are punished. This economy in Colorado County continues to grow. as cotton continues to increase in profit. In fact, Colorado County had the 5th largest cotton crop of all Texas counties in 1860 with more than 14,000 bales. This prosperous cotton and slave-rich county also boasts the Bayou Brazos and Colorado Railway that Terri mentioned. It ends in Allington, where Mavis lived. So Allington is an important link to shipping cotton out to the rest of the South. And then during the war, it shifts to being the place where the cotton from the South is brought and then switched to wagons. And then they take the wagons down to Mexico in hopes of either selling them in Mexico or being able to get around the Union blockade of the Gulf and ship cotton out to international markets from there. So it's very important to the economy of the South and cotton. Despite this area's strong ties to cotton and slavery, even this area was not entirely pro-secession. When the county votes in favor, it votes with 584 in favor of leaving the United States and 330 against leaving the United States. Many of those who vote against secession are German. In fact, 1/3 of that vote comes from the single German town of Frelsburg, who voted against secession 154 to 22. But the Germans were outnumbered. And as pro-Union Germans found out all across the state, they did not have a lot of choice when it came to supporting the Confederacy. Now, Gillespie County and Colorado County saw different sides of the Civil War because of their location and diversity of opinions on secession. In Gillespie County, the Civil War was marked by violence on the Texas frontier. The first consequence of secession was removing federal troops. That means all these frontier towns have lost their law enforcement and lost their protection against Native American attacks. Texas realizes this. The Texas governor orders a local militia formed to protect the westernmost settlements. In Gillespie County, one of the first troops of mounted rangers formed was led by a pro-Union German named Jacob Kukler, who recruited fellow pro-Union men in hopes that they would be able to protect their homes from Indian attacks and also protect their homes from any Confederate interference. Unfortunately, word of their true purpose got out, and Kukler's militia was disbanded. While many Germans took the oath of loyalty to the Confederacy to protect their lives and property, other Germans encouraged residents to resist the Confederate draft. In the spring of 1862, up to 500 pro-Union residents of Gillespie County created the Union Loyal League. Their goal was to protect their members from Confederate interference and Native American attack, prevent members from being compelled to take up arms against the United States, and prepare to assist any Union army that invaded Texas. Word got out about that organization, and General Hamilton B. of the Texas Militia and Confederate Army declares the counties of Gillespie, Kendall, and Kerr to be in open rebellion and commands that the insurrection be put down. In response, many suspected Unionists are captured, beaten, and killed. Farms were burned and families terrorized. Neighbor turned against neighbor as accusations flew, and retaliation without any legal consequences was common on both sides. Now, some tried to flee the violence. In August of 1862, about 65 members of the Union Loyal League traveled south towards Mexico in hopes of avoiding the Confederate draft and eventually joining the Union Army. On the banks of the Nueces River, troops from the Texas and the Confederacy attack and defeat the Unionists. 19 are killed in battle. Some are taken prisoner and then executed. A few manage to flee to the southern border, try and cross the Rio Grande, and are killed there. In total, out of the about 65 that tried to flee, and it wasn't all German, there were a few Hispanic members and Anglo members in there too, but the vast majority were German. Of those that tried to flee, 36 were killed. A few managed to flee to Mexico, did make it across the Rio Grande. Most of those survivors returned to Gillespie County and spent the rest of the war hiding in the hills. Later, the remains of those killed were brought to the town of Comfort, which is not too far from here. And in 1866, a memorial was placed in honor of those who were true to the Union. And that's where the title for our talk today came from. That True to the Union or Loyal to the Union is the name of this monument that we have here, which most folks might not expect to be traveling through Texas, rural Texas, and all the stereotypes that come with rural Texas, and come across this very pro-Union monument that was established right after the Civil War. But the legacy of the Nueces Massacre and all the violence that happened during the Civil War is still well known in this area and still talked of. In fact, one of our colleagues here at the Sauer-Beckmann Living History Farm, he's a descendant of one of those Unionists. His great-great-grandfather, Carl Itz, survived the Nueces Massacre. and avoided capture in the hills of Gillespie County. But he was hunted because they knew how many people had tried to flee. So when Confederate soldiers were unable to find Carl Itz, they took 2 of his brothers from the field where they were plowing, brought them into Fredericksburg, and hung them as a warning to any others who might be harboring survivors. The rest of the Civil War was marked by hangings, property destruction, and violence between pro-Union and pro-Confederate neighbors. In contrast, Colorado County did not see the violence that characterized the Texas frontier. 200 miles further to the east meant that those in Colorado County were solidly within the borders of the Confederacy. No fighting took place within that county, as all efforts were turned to the Cotton Road, transferring that cotton down to Mexico, and conversely transporting goods from Mexico onto the railroad at Alleyton. The county's dependence on cotton and slavery meant its economy was devastated by the war. The value of Colorado County farms fell by 5/6 by the end of the war. Now, these 2 counties' very different experiences within the war probably shaped the Germans who lived there. So looking in at, again, our 2 gentlemen, the Sauers and the Mavises.
Both are on record as Confederate veterans. They had very different motivations. Mr. Sauer joined the Confederacy. The records I can find have him under different commanders and different squads for each year: 1861, 1862, 1863, 1864. We found it very interesting that in 1862, he was under Kukler, that commander who was very pro-Union. So Mr. Sauer may have picked up many of his pro-Union ideas from them. We highly suspect that he was pro-Union. Kukler was the guy that was leading Germans and others to Mexico that became part of the Nueces massacre, but he did survive. The men around here, they served patrolling and protecting from invasion from the Native Americans, all in Texas, but we have records to prove that Mr. Sauer stayed mostly in Gillespie County serving here. He was discharged in 1865. Mr. Mavis served in the Confederacy also. We found him under 2 different records. He enlisted in 1862, but was discharged that same year in the spring for rheumatism. He was hospitalized in Houston, and he was discharged. His daughter tells the story about that for him, but we also found him listed in 1863 as part of the 22nd Brigade. He was in service for 3 months. So that is the information we found out on their Confederates serving during the Civil War.
So talking about the 2 of them, thinking about their family backgrounds, where they are in the social status, where they live, what their communities are like. Again, take a moment and stop and think about what you might have done given the circumstances. So if you're in the Hill Country and you're pro-Union, would you try to flee? Or would you sign up in hopes that you're able to stay and protect your home and not be sent to the front lines? Better that you sign up and choose to serve in the Frontier Regiment than possibly be drafted and sent to fight a war you don't care about much further east. It is a little bit ironic that when you look back at the roster of Confederate soldiers, that there's a fair number of Germans on there, and most likely they did not all support the Confederacy. Johann Friedrich Sauer probably joined to protect his hometown, and most likely did not support the Confederacy, considering the man that he served under and the fact that he stayed very, very, very close to home and never owned slaves. But recently, Terri visited his grave during the Memorial Day holiday, and it was decorated with Confederate flags, likely placed there by a local historical society or descendants of other Confederate soldiers. In many parts of the South today, the Confederate flag has been adopted as a symbol of rural America and traditionalism, but it's pretty ironic to see it hanging on the fences and driveways or bumper stickers of folks that are of German descent that have been here for a long time, considering their ancestors probably did not support that flag. So like everything in history, the story of Civil War Texas is more complicated than it seems at first glance. Just because immigrants came to Texas doesn't mean they embraced all the societal norms of Texas. Just because they swore an oath to the Confederacy or even enlisted does not mean that they were pro-slavery. But conversely, just because they were German doesn't mean that they were in favor of freedom for all. Their backgrounds, their beliefs, their socioeconomic status and location shaped their choices in the bloodiest time in American history. Just like today, there are many factors that shape our worldview. So when you look back at history, or when you go visit the DAR Museum and you look in at one of the period rooms and read a brief synopsis of the family that once lived there, take some time, if you have it and you've got the interest, to dig a little into the context of those who once lived there. Understanding someone's background and context helps us understand their choices. And that's true today. We can only hope that future generations will do the same thing to us when they look back at our choices. When people are looking back at 2020 and 2021 in the history books, we can hope that they will also look back on what the context was and what other factors played into all of our decisions, as we also live in a very contested time in American history. So that's what we wanted to share with you today about the Sauers and the Mavis family, and give you a little bit of perspective on German immigration and German history in Texas. So now we are available for any questions that you might have for Terri and I, and let us know what you've got to ask us. We've got the chat box open, I believe, and then also the Q&As. If you want to ask a question in the Q&As, that's the best chance. All righty. I think Katie should be jumping back in too. All right, we do see a question in the question box right here. Actually, two of them just popped in. The first one is asking about who Fredericksburg, Texas was named after. I'm actually double checking that to make sure I don't give you poor information. It is also named after a German named Frederick, since it was a pretty common name. But I will double check on that real quick to make sure I have that accurate. And Terri, would you like to take the next one?
I can answer the next question. The question is, once Germans settled in Texas, did they stay or did they migrate, either inter or intrastate? That is an excellent question. Here in Fredericksburg, they tended to stay. There's a generation now that is starting to move away a bit, but we work with two Germans. They are a 5th and 6th generation from here in Fredericksburg area. So those stayed. That's why when we were doing the Mavis family research, once he passed away, his family kept moving. So they ended up even in South Texas. So it depended. I'm curious whether the Adelsverein had any influence on that, because they brought such a large group of Germans that it was easier to stay, or maybe it's just in their DNA to dig roots in and stay.
And in answer to the first question, I was thinking it was Frederick, but I want to double check, so I'm correct. Fredericksburg, Texas is named after Prince Frederick of Prussia. He was one of the influential members of the Adelsverein, that immigration society that was working to bring folks over. From what I understand from the book that I've read, he was not the most vocal, but he spent the most money. So that's why
Very helpful.
they got a little bit named after him, because he did that. So that is who was named after, Frederick of Prussia. All righty, any other questions? Oh, I'm looking in the chat box. Oh, here's another question. Were there German settlements in North Texas during the Civil War? There were German settlements all over. And yes, there's even a town like Munster that Mark always talks about.
Yes.
That's much further. Yes, they were making their way now predominantly right along like the Red River border between Texas and Oklahoma. Those counties were actually all very strong pro-union as well, but that's because a lot of them that settled were from further in the United States. Those settlers came from further north in the US. And then also, again, you're bordering Indian Territory with bordering Oklahoma at that point. And so you rely heavily on the federal troops. So it did seem like more the north and then the west or central Texas at those points are more pro-union. But yes, there are German settlements, little scattered towns all through North Texas and all through East Texas and just about everywhere. You can drive on the interstate and you'll pass a town and go, oh wait, okay, I can tell who settled there. And then of course later in the 19th century, we end up with a lot of Czech and Polish towns as well. A lot more folks start coming from Eastern Europe.
I'd like to comment on, somebody left a comment researching German family in New Mexico. I also had a problem with Mr. Mavis because he is in a mostly Anglo community, And the misspellings on his name were various, and modern translation of his name. Mr. Sauer is in a strongly German community. There was some modern issues with saying Lauer instead of Sauer for him, but much easier to find you when you stay in the same county.
Yes. Yeah. It's hard to track people when their names change. So besides political differences, did German settlers experience any more cultural clashes with other settler groups in Texas?
I want to laugh because the Germans, there were high Germans and low Germans, so there were clashes among Germans.
Yes.
Like, you don't date Germans from Comfort, Texas at a certain time.
Yes. Yeah, the diversity in Germans themselves comes through loud and clear, where there's rivalry between different towns, and then there's also different motivations for coming. So in our area, in Gillespie County, we've got a lot of farmers, but just north of us, there was what's now near the town of Castell, I believe it was called Bettina, was a utopian society set up by German intellectuals. Apparently they were all like young college kids that came over and tried to set up their version of utopia. And as can happen, they did not do a great job because they didn't have the skill set or necessarily the tools to be able to set up a productive farm. So they lasted like 2 years, then all the crops failed, and then they all just ended up being assimilated in other places. But there was also other communities closer to us where there were Latin communities where they spoke Latin, language of the educated, and kind of separated themselves. There were some that were Catholic communities, some that were Lutheran, some that mixed together, some that were anti-religion. So amongst the Germans themselves, there's a fair bit of diversity on who comes over, and there's a lot of contrast between them on those Germans over there compared to us Germans over here. So that's amongst the Germans, and then cultural clashes with other settler groups. In a lot of cases, it's just every time you're a new person moving to an area and you're contrasting with those around you. So the way you build your homes, there's, I think Friedrich Law Olmsted, when he goes through the South, he writes and he makes a lot of observations about early Texas. And he said as he traveled through Texas, he heard a lot of people disparaging the Germans. Oh, those foreigners, and they do things so differently, and they eat weird food, and it's so different. And then he got to the hill country and said this was the best place he had seen in Texas, and said their farms are well kept, they're doing great. So there's some also slight cultural differences in that the Germans, like when they're building, these Germans, they're coming from like a tradition of building with clockwork houses. So they're building very sturdy houses. They take a long time to build, but those houses don't go anywhere. So their architecture is very different. Also, we've heard, at least in this area with the Germans, they were very pragmatic, and they might have been even more eager than your average farmer to send the wife out into the field to go work, because they just wanted to bring the crop in, and who cares about separate spheres or whatever. Yeah. And now on most farms, everybody's pitching in, but it was commented on by observers that it was surprising how often the women were out working, not in the home, but working out in the field, because they just wanted to make some money. So the Germans are frugal, and they're going to make sure they can be productive. And then, of course, later in time, there's conflicts in the fact that World War I and World War II, it is not very popular to speak German. And if you're isolated, it's not so much of a big deal. But one of our colleagues, his wife, her grandparents, I think, were children and were visiting San Antonio, and during World War II, and they're standing in line at the grocery store in San Antonio, and they start speaking to each other in German, as they did, and people in the store turned around and yelled at them and called them Nazis, because it was not popular to speak German at that point. So throughout the war, throughout many wars, there's opportunities for them to be on the opposite side of what people are used to. So yes, anytime you're mixing cultures, there are clashes, but there are clashes even amongst the Germans themselves. Yes. How has German cooking influenced the hill country?
Sausage.
A whole lot of sausage. Yeah. A lot of sausage in this area. They also have a lot of sauerkraut. So there's sausage, sauerkraut, a lot of meat. Huge part of meat culture.
Our cheeses stayed up until the 80s, probably. Yes. 1980s. The dry curd cheese and the cooked cheese is very predominant around here up until that time. We get people from other German communities in Texas who may have heard of it or may not have, but the cheese stuck around till quite a long time.
Yes. There's also a lot of mixing, like we mentioned, with the Hispanic culture. So there's actually a lot of overlap between the Anglo culture, Hispanic, and the German culture, where you end up with a lot of sausages and all of them.
Beer and sausage music.
Pretty much. And strong family orientation
Yes.
between Hispanic and German cultures, big parties with a lot of alcohol.
Farming.
Like there's actually, they said that in this area, the same musicians played in like the polka oompa bands would play in the mariachi bands, and that the musicians would play in both. And there's even overlap of instruments. And so a lot of
Tejano music is very influenced by polka.
Yep. So a lot of music, but then also, yes, a lot of cooking as well.
And we should mention tomato okra gumbo that we made yesterday. Our Germans had to adapt to crops that grow in the summertime. So in the 1916 Fredericksburg Home Cookbook, they had tomato okra gumbo, which we traditionally make here at the farm. You can tomatoes with the okra and onions, and you save that, and that makes kind of a one dish meal. You brown beef and throw that in there, and you have a meal ready once it simmers. So it influenced it. Even to this day, people come and they still make it at home.
All right, another question I saw in the chat box. Did the Germans establish churches, and did their clergy guide their outlook on the Confederacy and slavery? Great question. Yes, they established churches. There are churches all over this place. In fact, the two colleagues that we work with who are both of German descent, one is of Lutheran descent and one is of Catholic descent. So of course they always have to tease each other about what good Germans truly are, whether they're German or Catholic, because they both go back a long time. The Germans have churches all over the place. They're very focused on it. Did their clergy guide their outlook on the Confederacy and slavery? I would assume that they would, but we don't have things published.
Right.
So I would assume that if you're gathering with your church members, maybe even not from the pulpit, but after church and you're all gathering and talking and eating together, that would come up and you would listen to your clergy and whatever they had to recommend. But as far as publishing, no, but then also, especially in this area, we do have newspapers, but as a whole, you're just going to be talking with your neighbors. You're not going to be publishing to a wider audience like you would, say, if you were in San Antonio. In that case, you're deciding the minority. So you probably learned your lesson from 1854 and didn't publish anymore. So we would assume the clergy played a role, but we do not know for sure. I don't have it written.
Somebody missed about why they flocked to the South.
Why did they flock to the South? I did find some who served the Union and migrated either post-Civil War or during the Western expansion to Santa Fe. Talking specifically about Texas, they came because of Texas Promising Land and the Adelsverein, the official immigration society in Germany that promoted immigration to Texas. But of course, from studying the United States history, Germans have been coming for centuries, and there are strong German contingents all over the United States that go back a long, 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 long time. So it's one of the many cultures.
Thinkers and Comfort didn't really have churches, did they? That is a great question. The free thinkers having churches.
I don't think they were not as
religious.
They came seeking more of a utopian society, more of a Latin society. So yes, they did not gather around the church as much as the others did. Probably why good Catholics and Lutherans from Fredericksburg didn't date people from
that area.
We actually had a volunteer who was from Comfort, and she was 79.
Oh, she was nice.
And she was awesome. And so at 79, she was like, oh yeah, growing up, like Comfort and Fredericksburg, those Germans.
Yep.
We don't have anything to do with those Germans.
Parents even would ostracize their children if they kept dating somebody from the opposite community.
Yep. People pick sides. That's what they do. All righty. Oh, thank you. Any other questions? Anything you want to pitch in and share?
I think this was fun. This has been a fascinating research project. So thank you, Katie, for introducing us to the Mavis family. They had a different way of living and thinking than our normal, typical Germans here.
Well, thank you both so much. I found that fascinating. It was wonderful. Definitely deepened my understanding. So I've been saying that family's name wrong this whole time. So thank you for correcting my pronunciation. Now I will say Mavis.
Best guess. We were talking with our colleagues who are of German descent, and you were pronouncing the Kuhlmann name, and they said that's not how you pronounce it. It's Kuhlmann, and she was like, "Well, Schumann, like, should it be that?" And he was like, "Well, this is how we say it." And I'm like, "Well, that's how Texans now say it. When they arrived, it might have been different, but yes, everything's Texas twang on it."
Oh my, well, thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. Yes, we are recording this. It is actually streaming live to our YouTube channel, and it will be archived there afterwards. And so you can you can go back and soak up every little detail at your leisure. So thank you both, Hannah and Terri. It's been fabulous to have you with us, and I will definitely, the next time I find myself in Texas, I will look up your farm because I've never been there.
Yes, you have to come visit. We'll have fun.
All right. Thanks very much. And thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Have a great